Vietnam, 1965. A brutal civil war is raging in Southeast Asia. Now American ground forces invade to stop communist guerrillas from overrunning the South.
There's a common misconception that tanks, were not used very much in Vietnam.
The Americans count on conventional firepower to stop the guerrillas. But they face a deadly, determined opponent.
The North Vietnamese, they knew what they were doing.
By itself, a tank is vulnerable in guerrilla and insurgent operations.
All of a sudden, the RPGs start flying.
And he screams, "We're hit!"
The Vietnam War represents the first great tank versus guerrilla series of battles.
And that's when all hell broke loose.
Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Today, it is a prosperous and peaceful nation. And in every city and town are images of Ho Chi Minh. They remind its people of the man who sought to create an independent country during decades of terrible fighting, in which millions of Vietnamese died. Throughout Vietnam are many remnants of that deadly past. War cemeteries, unexploded bombs and shells, and long-abandoned American tanks. In early 1965, the United States makes the fateful decision to send ground troops to Vietnam as tensions rise between the American-backed regime in the South and the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh. March 8, 1965. An expeditionary force of 3,500 Marines lands at Da Nang. Its mission is to defeat the North Vietnamese, who are on the verge of overrunning South Vietnam.
The U.S. saw that as part of this controversial domino effect in which if South Vietnam fell, next to fall would be Indonesia and the Philippines, and all of Asia would become communist. Whereas in reality, the Vietnamese simply saw this as a nationalistic war to reunite their country.
Landing with the Marines are 2 platoons of 3rd Tank Battalion armor.
There's a common misconception that tanks were not used very much in Vietnam. The Marines actually had a history of using tanks for infantry support that reached back to World War II. There's no real way to carry a large cannon around the battlefield, for direct fire infantry support, except a tank.
Infantry support in Vietnam will be provided by the M48 tank. The M48A3 Patton tank boasts a high-velocity 90mm main gun, 110 millimeters of frontal armor, and a top speed of 45 kilometers per hour.
The M48 was designed for tank-on-tank action. The goal of the American Tank Force in the 1960s was, in effect, to destroy Soviet tanks.
The Americans are prepared for head-to-head combat with the Russians. But in Vietnam, their tanks face a different kind of enemy: the Viet Cong, or VC.
The Viet Cong was a local guerrilla force, intimately familiar with the area. Their specialization was infiltration, ambushes.
The initial role of tanks in Vietnam is to protect U.S. air bases.
Because the original commitment of the U.S. in Vietnam was to base aircraft in South Vietnam for airstrikes across into North Vietnam.
As the VCs step up their attacks against the air bases, U.S. Commander William Westmoreland adopts a new strategy.
Westmoreland was a World War II general with a World War II mentality. And his goal, as he saw it, was to bring the Vietnamese to a conventional battle in which they could be destroyed by conventional firepower, in which the U.S. excelled, of course.
He launches the first major American ground offensive of the war, Operation Starlight.
Intelligence indicated formations massing for additional attacks against airfields. So the idea was to go in and break these up.
Operation Starlight involves a preemptive strike against Viet Cong guerrillas who threaten the vital airbase at Chu Lai. The Viet Cong have 1,500 men, armed with hundreds of light anti-tank weapons. Against the VC, the Americans deploy an initial force of over 3,000 Marines, supported by a dozen tanks. August 18th, 1965. Marine tanks head inland to seek out the enemy. Confidence in the mission is high.
That's what we're there for. We're all excited to be going to war.
As the fighting rages, Marines in the field are soon in need of supplies. And tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion are called in.
We were going to provide security for 5 Amtraks that were loaded with sea rations and water. And we were to deliver those sea rations and water to our troops.
But the American commanders make a crucial error. Supply Column 21 heads off without any infantry support.
By itself, a tank is vulnerable in guerrilla and insurgent operations. To make a tank less vulnerable, one has to surround it with protective infantry.
Infantry support can deter an enemy from getting too close to the tanks.
Because a tank is relatively blind, if you can get up close to it, you can actually, deploy a number of anti-tank weapons.
As the convoy advances deeper into the jungle, it finds itself on a small trail.
The nature of the terrain restricted the movement of tanks.
Hundreds of VC guerrillas seize the opportunity to close in on the isolated convoy.
We're in a fairly dense, dark jungle. It wasn't very long that we were now taking small arms fire. You'd see muzzle flashes. We listened to the thwack, thwack, thwack of small arms fire hitting our tank. I was terrified. I couldn't see very well. It's like being in a paper bag with a little bitty pinhole to see out of, and you know there's bad stuff out there. I'm using my 30 caliber machine gun. I know that I don't have a lot of ammunition, because I'm trying to literally pick a target and hit it. My tank commander said, "We're coming to a clearing." I'm looking across a sunny opening. I'm looking at a rice paddy. But I see the first tank take either an anti-tank rocket or an anti-tank gun.
The Viet Cong have sprung a trap, a maneuver ambush. The maneuver ambush involves taking out the lead tank in a convoy, then the rear tank, then targeting the rest of the immobilized column. The first stage has worked. The lead tank has been halted.
Military warfare training tells you we're next. And bam, my tank commander screams, "We're hit! We're hit!" And he said, "Abandon tank." And I see Corporal Vickery's feet going out the top hatch. I get up and I look out the periscopes, and there's two guys just inside the edge of the jungle. He comes up and he fires a rocket and clangs off and bounces away. I turn back and look, and I can't get the gun down on him. He's too close to get down over the fenders.
The Viet Cong had a tactic known as hugging their enemy's belt. Close in so close that the tank cannot bring its main gun to bear.
The Marines are surrounded, and radio communication with headquarters is cut off. The lead tank is out of ammunition, and its crew wounded, so it pulls back to get help.
It rolled back into the jungle and was gone.
Hearn's lone tank is left to prevent the convoy from being annihilated by the Viet Cong.
I'm getting some black smoke in the turret. It's noxious. I decide it's time to get out. I stand up in there in a crouched position, and now I'm watching this 3.5 rocket launcher over here. He fires around. It hits just below the cupola, clangs off, climbed up and jumped out and jumped right over the back of the tank. There beside me is Corporal Vickery. He's on his hands and knees. He says, "Hearn, I'm hit. Hearn, I'm hit." It's obvious sooner or later they're just going to walk in and get us.
Supply Column 21 is down to a handful of Marines, struggling to hold off the VC. The final stage of the ambush begins. The Viet Cong close in for the kill.
And as I'm leaned up there, I take a bullet in the side of my neck. Much of the back of my head is blown out of my mouth.
Private Hearn is left for dead when the VC withdraw into the jungle. The next day, Hearn and the other survivors of Supply Column 21 are finally rescued. By the time Operation Starlight ends, Viet Cong losses are estimated at over 600 dead.
We underestimated them really, really badly. That was the case very early on in Vietnam. Operation Starlight was successful in that it did achieve its tactical goal, which was to break up units that were potentially massing for an attack on the airfields.
However, the U.S. Marines suffer 45 dead, and a quarter of their tankers are wounded or killed. In 1967, the United States has increased its military forces in Vietnam to 400,000 troops and hundreds of tanks.
William Westmoreland was one of the main drivers in that he saw this as a conventional struggle and was constantly asking for more and more troops to expand these operational areas.
Ho Chi Minh counters the U.S. buildup by reinforcing Viet Cong insurgents with units of the regular North Vietnamese Army, or NVA.
The NVA were highly motivated. Their motto was, "Recruited in the North to die in the South." They were extremely disciplined, and they were better equipped than the Viet Cong, with Soviet weapons, complete with artillery and things like this.
The Americans must now stop thousands of NVA soldiers from infiltrating across the border into South Vietnam. They establish a series of fire bases along the 100-kilometer border that divides North and South Vietnam, known as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ.
The demilitarized zone was an area that was supposed to be devoid of military forces and not used for military operations, effectively to separate North and South Vietnam.
The Marines started moving north to defend the areas around the DMZ and the major infiltration routes. So what you ended up with then was a face-off between the regular North Vietnamese formations and the Marine units along the DMZ.
Near the eastern end of the border is the Giao Linh Fire Base. It is protected by 5 M48s from the Marines' 3rd Tank Battalion.
As the U.S. began to establish a more far-flung network of bases, particularly along the DMZ, one of the things that would happen is they were subject to constant attacks by the NVA.
There was one time up at Guerilla where we were getting hammered by artillery fire, more so than usual. Incoming was constant.
One of the chronic problems they faced was that the North Vietnamese artillery, the Soviet-made artillery, outranged even the larger American artillery. And frequently the tank cannons were the only things that could reply to that fire at extremely long ranges.
My tank commander came to us one morning and said, "Oh, we've got a crazy mission." He said, "We're going to take our tank and one other tank, and we're going to run into North Vietnam. We're going to run through the DMZ."
Both forces were to remain outside and not operate within. But they were somewhat selective in their adherence to the treaty.
There were crack regiments of NVA in the area. We ended up perching ourselves on a little rise overlooking a huge expanse in North Vietnam. And our orders are to pick out any targets that seem suspicious and fire.
Now, the 90mm cannon was frequently used for harassment and interdiction fire, where you would fire at long ranges against a fixed target that could not necessarily be hit by artillery or air power.
The range finder went up to 4,400 yards. I saw something on the other side of this old dried-up rice field. And I put the crosshairs on as best I could. And it landed well short. So I raised the crosshairs up and took another shot. And the second round or so hit. Even from 3 miles away or so. Secondary explosions were tremendous. We knew that we had hit something. We were there for maybe 3 minutes, turned around and hightailed it back to Guerilla. We had knocked out the enemy artillery site that had been pounding the hill. We felt like the heroes of the hill, and it was something to be able to do that.
July 2nd, 1967. From their firebase at Con Thien, Alpha and Bravo companies, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, set out towards the DMZ on an operation codenamed Buffalo. Their mission is to head northeast from Con Thien, cross the Trace, and then sweep the area south of the demilitarized zone.
The role of the Marines changed from defense to aggressive patrolling and seeking out the enemy along what they called the Trace, which was a cleared belt of terrain that ran parallel to the border between North and South Vietnam, simply because they knew that they could not defend these base areas unless they went out into the countryside and sought out the enemy.
As they advance, Bravo 19 has no idea they are walking towards a much larger force of battle-hardened troops of the North Vietnamese Army's 90th Regiment, waiting to ambush them.
Operation Buffalo represented 9-to-1 odds in favor of the North Vietnamese, which meant they could literally overwhelm the American company.
The NVA spring a trap on the American patrol. The Marines take heavy casualties and radio back for help from the tanks at Con Thien. Amongst them is the crew of Tank B-23.
They called on our 4 tanks that were stationed at Con Thien.
Bravo 19 was getting overrun.
They got themselves into a situation where they walked into an ambush.
What the tank force doesn't know is that NVA troops are now waiting to ambush them.
The North Vietnamese knew very well that a reaction force, usually built around tanks, would be sent out to help support and protect them. So they would lie in wait for that.
The beleaguered Marines of Bravo 19 have taken heavy casualties when the tanks arrive.
Got to the troops that were still left.
We were taking dead and severely wounded, throwing them on the tank. As Marines, we don't leave the bodies behind. The North Vietnamese, they knew what they were doing. Bravo 19 had walked into an ambush, closed around them, and circled them. As soon as we got up near that circle, the North Vietnamese had a bigger circle, which closed around us. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Operation Buffalo represents perhaps an inefficient number of tanks to truly make the difference against a much larger force.
Incoming artillery and mortars started dropping all over us.
We got across a creek and a spotter airplane radioed down to us to turn around that we were in North Vietnam.
Just went in, swung around, and came back.
That's when my tank hit a mine.
But when a mine goes off, you're jerked up and down. You're taking a 52-ton tank, which is a lot of weight, and blowing it up in the air probably 2-3 foot. And it blew off a couple road wheels and the track.
You're sitting there, the radios don't work, and you got a road wheel missing, and track is off, and you're in trouble.
The crew of Tank B-23 now need rescuing themselves.
Gunny Eckler, he's in the other tank, and he's not disabled, but he's going to try to get us out of there.
I'd attach a tow cable, which is probably a 2-inch thick steel cable from tank to tank.
Gunny started dragging us out, and I remember being in that driver's hatch, the heat coming off of that engine, off the other tank was just, I thought I was gonna be cooked alive.
It was a short time later, as we're getting ready to leave, a couple of RPG teams got up close to us.
I remember them yelling and saying there's an RPG team, and I'm in the driver's hatch, and I look out the vision block, and they let loose with a round.
The RPG-2 is the NVA's primary anti-tank weapon. It is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that fires a 1.8 kilogram shaped charge that can bore through 200 millimeters of armor.
And the first RPG hit our gypsy rack.
We got hit in the gypsy rack, and I remember brass was flying all over the place.
While we were being towed out, we started to go up a slight little dike. One of the guys saw an RPG team come out.
When that RPG was aiming at us, the tank was actually being dragged like this and was up in the air. It was going up over that dike. They were aiming for the bottom of the tank.
Just as he fired, we started to come down from that dike. And the RPG bounced off the slope plate.
The RPG usually was not capable of destroying a tank, but it was absolutely deadly to crews. You can get what's called a spalling effect, where fragments of the tank's own armor break loose and ricochet around the interior. And that's what does most of the damage to personnel inside the tank, is bits and pieces of the tank's own armor.
The loader's hatch was open. It was sitting up like this, and it hit the loader's hatch.
And then shrapnel from that hit me in both legs and hit Terry Hunter in the back.
I was literally blown halfway up out of the hatch. And the shrapnel came down inside, and it wounded Brightwell.
I had shrapnel in my leg, my shoulder, my arm.
He looked like a Martian. He had all these pieces of shrapnel sticking out of his helmet. We were smoking and on fire inside.
And it was really funny. We were trying to put out what we thought was a fire with a fire extinguisher. Well, it was an empty fire extinguisher because we had used the CO inside of it to cool down some beer the night before.
And all of a sudden, there's green tracer rounds are coming at us.
Gunny Eckler just put his foot to the floor. And we made it out. Made it out to the landing zone. Later on, 3 of my crew members, including myself, were medevac to Cam Ranh Bay Hospital.
During the first day of Operation Buffalo, at least 55 North Vietnamese soldiers are killed. But on that same day, the Americans lose 86 men killed in action, and another 190 wounded, making it their costliest day of the war so far. Despite the losses, U.S. Commander General Westmoreland is determined to increase his forces in South Vietnam.
And was constantly asking for more and more troops to draw them into a climactic conventional battle in which he could destroy the North Vietnamese forces in Vietnam.
January 1968. The North Vietnamese have their own plan to escalate the war. The Communists launch a New Year or Tet offensive, simultaneously attacking over 100 cities, towns, and villages throughout South Vietnam.
Major Tet offensive in early 1968 was that trigger for what they saw as the potential uprising in which they would finally throw out the invaders.
Tet is a major setback for the U.S. war in South Vietnam.
It did provide a political tipping point because it turned American public opinion against the war. The American public and increasingly the political leaders no longer saw it as a winnable war.
After weeks of vicious fighting, the offensive is crushed.
Tet was an absolute disaster for the Viet Cong because these units were exposed to American and South Vietnamese firepower. A lot of them were wiped out. There was no alternative for the communists but to send down increasing numbers of units that had been raised and equipped in the north, regular units of the North Vietnamese Army, equipped with more sophisticated anti-tank weapons. And it was just a fundamental change in the nature of the war to a more conventional war against the North Vietnamese Army.
1968 is turning out to be the bloodiest year of the war. U.S. intelligence pinpoints areas where the enemy is massing its forces. One of these is Go Noi Island, where the NVA has a divisional headquarters.
They would come in and establish secure areas from which they could make forays and attacks against the surrounding areas. And one of those was Gonoy Island, which was the objective of Operation Allen Brook.
Gonoy is 24 kilometers south of Da Nang, surrounded by two rivers and bisected by an old railroad bridge. May 4th, 1968. The Americans send a Marine force to eliminate the enemy entrenched on Gonoy, including M48s from the 1st and 5th Tank Battalions. At the head of the armored column is the crew of Tank B-24.
We moved across onto the island, and within hours, the infantry that we were supporting started taking fire and taking heavy fire.
We encountered small arms, machine gun fire, mortar attack.
The communists were taking full advantage of knowing the terrain on which they were fighting and being able to choose where they would fight.
The heavy machine gun fire from the 51 caliber Russian machine guns were shooting a tremendous volume of fire at the helicopters, and we decided it was very unsafe for them to come in, and so we actually had to the first 4 or 5 days without resupply. That meant they were going to run out of food, they were running out of water, and of course we were certainly running out of ammunition.
To get supplies for the main force, the crew of Tank B-24 lead 3 M48s and 2 Amtraks back to their base.
So that morning, on the 6th day, I was forming a column.
We crossed the tree line, didn't encounter anything. And about 400 yards later was another tree line. And you never knew when you approached the tree line, was it safe or not? We did something that's called recon by fire. And the tanks would start using the machine gun and taking that tree line under fire. The enemy doesn't know you don't know they're there. And so they would start firing.
All of a sudden, the RPGs start flying and machine guns start flying.
We were taking a lot of fire. We effectively had been ambushed.
And we started to return fire immediately.
We're firing the cannon, firing a lot of cannon rounds.
Eventually, we ran out of 90mm ammunition. When the NBA saw that the big gun wasn't shooting anymore, then they attempted to get on the tanks.
Which was a specialty of the NVA. They had no qualms at all about climbing on a tank and to jam things like a satchel charge up under the rack at the rear of the turret, to jam the turret, try to get a grenade inside the vehicle, or simply try to kill the crew with small arms fire.
I said, scratch my back, or got the NVA on me, or something like that.
Scratch my back. And in tank terms, that means you turn the machine guns on another tank.
He swung his turret around.
He fired a flechette round, which had little tiny darts in it. But it took the enemy off the tank.
The communist attack on the resupply convoy is taking a toll. The Marines are desperately low on ammunition and in danger of being overrun. A break in the fighting finally allows a helicopter to land.
That afternoon, a helicopter tried to come in to pick up the dead.
As the American chopper approaches, the enemy watches and waits.
We didn't think we had anyone around us, any enemy around us at that point. They just started to get off the ground when all hell opened up. The helicopter took a hit and started auto-gyrating. And at that point you said, my God, we're surrounded.
The Marines are ordered to protect the downed chopper so it can be salvaged and not fall into enemy hands.
So they said, well, stay with the chopper that night. So we set a 360 up.
It was starting to get dark. We knew we were going to get hit that night. There was no question in our minds.
The NVA used a number of techniques that we might consider psychological warfare. The main one was to present the image that they owned the countryside and the night. This meant that any American force out in the countryside could reasonably expect to have a series of probes and attacks throughout the night, deny them rest, and to keep them on edge throughout the time.
We're sitting there watching NVA that was probably 50 yards away from us. A young Marine came over and said, hey Sarge, there's people in front of your tank with rockets. And I said, well, start shooting them.
And all of a sudden, out in front of us, there was this explosion.
And that RPG, we can see it rotating. It comes right over between the two of us.
And landed behind the tank.
It hit between my feet and knocked me down. 15 or 20 RPGs came over the tank, the side of the tank.
I'm now down inside the tank. And my driver, he was probably 18 or 19. He said, are we going to make it out of here?
But the North Vietnamese again break off their attack, disappearing into the night and thousands of hidden tunnels that crisscross Go Noi Island.
The problem is that the enemy simply just kind of melts away from in front of you and goes underground.
Dawn breaks, and the American tankers wonder when the next assault will begin. As they wait, they suddenly receive new orders.
The morning after the ambush, we were ordered to destroy the helicopter that we had guarded the night before.
U.S. commanders determined that another air rescue is too dangerous. Not wanting to leave anything the NVA can use, the Marines are ordered to destroy the chopper.
They said, blow the helicopter in place and move back towards Liberty Bridge.
Two weeks into Operation Allen Brook, the U.S. Marines continue to search Go Noi Island for the enemy. And from their fortified bunkers, the NVA continue to find deadly new tactics to harass the Americans.
We moved just off and out into this field. And as we did that, the infantry platoon leader called in an artillery strike.
A voice on the radio is calling for American artillery to shell the exact location of the American tanks.
Everybody's looking around in the tank saying, that's not right, that's not right. But it's an American voice, and it clearly was not our guys.
The NVA is using the American infantry's radio frequency to call in an artillery strike.
It was somebody who could speak perfect English, knew our frequencies, knew how to call in artillery.
And in 15 seconds, we've got 105 millimeter cannon shells, artillery shells, dropping right amongst us.
It's landing in our perimeter.
We now are under barrage from our own artillery.
When the Vietnamese communists could set the time and place of battle, they tended to be a step ahead.
Using another radio channel, the American tankers are finally able to stop the artillery barrage.
As I understand, we lost 70 Marines, either killed or seriously wounded, in that attack.
That concept of battle represents what we would call attrition. That is, grinding down your opponent's will to fight by grinding down their forces and inflicting casualties.
This was clearly an indication of us that, man, guys, things have changed. These guys are good. These guys are real good.
The Marines are ordered to pull back to the western end of Go Noi Island. The only route passes under a disused railroad bridge.
And the North Vietnamese would certainly know there was only one way out of there.
There was a tunnel.
The opening is just wide enough for a tank and 3 or 4 feet on each side.
There was no question that that underpass would be mined.
U.S. military developed a very healthy respect for the creativity, ingenuity, and lengths to which the North Vietnamese Army would go to inflict casualties upon them.
The infantry called in engineers who had mine detectors and what have you, and they probed the entire area under the bridge.
They swept through, got to the other side.
And discovered nothing.
Staff Sergeant Abisi said, no, I don't believe that. Check again.
I had them sweep it 4 or 5 times. I know there's a mine there. Oh, no, it's all clear. So I said, well, I'm not going to go through there. I need my tank for the commands. I took my other section tank. I said, okay, they said it's clear.
First tank starts to go through.
They started through there. As they begin to roll under the trestle, the track begins to roll out from underneath this trestle.
It wasn't a device that was an anti-tank mine that you would expect from the military. This was a homemade thing that was in a wooden box, so it was undetectable, if you will. And that's why the engineers missed it.
They came to be called IEDs in later wars. These had the capability of actually lifting a tank into the air and completely destroying it and killing the crew.
It killed all 3 of the engineers that had swept in front of us.
It's far more common now to counter tanks with IEDs. The idea any insurgent has is to transform their enemy's strengths into weaknesses. They teach their adversary to think of tanks not as a strength, but as a liability. In effect, the insurgent force is trying to teach the conventional force to stop using them.
Operation Allen Brook continues until August 1968. Communist losses are heavy, with close to 1,000 dead. By the time it's over, the Marines suffer more than 1,100 casualties. America's appetite for the war is waning. In 1969, they negotiate with the North for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Vietnam. Before the end of the year, the first American tanks are headed home. In the end, the mobile firepower of U.S. tanks proves no match for the unconventional tactics of the communists.
The Vietnam War represents the first great tank versus guerrilla series of battles. What we can learn about tank warfare coming out of Vietnam was the exact lesson the communist insurgents wanted to teach. That tanks represented a weakness in an insurgency as opposed to a strength.
Americans and other foreigners tend to forget that Vietnam has a very long history of resistance to foreign invaders. They were just one more colonial power that was trying to seize control of the country.
By 1972, most American forces have withdrawn from South Vietnam. The U.S. loses over 58,000 killed and 300,000 wounded during the war. April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks smashed down the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. North and South Vietnam are finally united after fighting that costs millions of lives.